Welcome to the Corporate Venturing Insider Series, where I interview top practitioners in the CVC world and learn with you the best practices and golden nuggets that they have accumulated over their career. In this episode, we will be learning from Tammy Mahn, Managing Director at Verizon Ventures. Tammy, could you take a few minutes to share your story and how you got to where you are today?
Sure. So first of all, thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure. I've watched the previous Insider series and it's great to be here. I've been around in Verizon Ventures for 2.5 years now, but I think my journey started in the Army, actually. So I was part of the intelligence unit, one of the elite intelligence units that a lot of the startups come from. And that was where I was first experienced like the power of technology. And I think that kind of stayed with me for a while. I then moved to doing other things. I went to school and then I joined McKinsey, which I think gave me a really good and solid background about the challenges that companies go through and accompany them throughout these challenges. And then I made that switch to the VC community. And for the past, I think it's over 17 years now, I've been a part of the Israeli ecosystem, but always in financial funds. So this is really my first corporate experience. And I'm just loving this because I've seen the ecosystem throughout the years. I think in 17 years, I've went through several downtimes. There was a lot of changes, a lot of revolutions in the way. So I started actually with a fund called Evergreen. It no longer exists. It evolved to another fund, but this was the first VC that was started in Israel. So this kind of gave me a great perspective into this new industry for me. I really transitioned from consulting and it was great. So I met the polar opposite of the companies that McKinsey works with. These were all tiny little startups. And then I moved to Pitanga, which is the largest fund in Israel by AUM. Again, different challenges, bigger partnership. It was all different for me, but I learned a lot. And I then moved to really my first experience. It's not a real corporate fund, but it was investing on behalf of a company. So it was a Swiss Israeli company that was looking for innovation. That was like the first notion that I had of what the power of investing on behalf of a company could be. And then I partnered with 3 Israeli companies and try to help them find a way into investing in startup companies around the whole topic of agri and food tech. So that was like the lead for me, shortening that 17 to 20 years into finally arriving at Verizon Ventures, which is where I am today and I'm proud to represent here in Israel.
Very nice. I would like to double click a little bit. First, Israel is a startup ecosystem and nation. And clearly you have a lot going on for Israel. But one thing you mentioned, which I think is important, is the army. Not just about technology, but I want you to maybe share that or not. The fact that women also goes to the army creates a leadership bench that goes into these startups. Could you share a bit about your view about how much of the army becomes something so valuable to the startups ecosystem and VC ecosystem?
Absolutely. I think that the reason that I mentioned it is because, first of all, I think that in Israel, the mandatory service is when you finish high school. So that puts you at 18. You're usually very young. You got a lot of energy and you're quick to learn. And as you mentioned, it's men and women serve in these units. We serve together. And I think Israel, because of its unique kind of position, the intelligence corps is actually pretty important to it. So a lot of the army budget goes to these units. And I always say, if you take good people, give them challenges and throw a lot of money to get them to solve it, it really creates something. And I think that's definitely true for at least in the beginning of the VC ecosystem. If you look at the mid 90s, when it started here in Israel, a lot of these startup companies were people that kind of were charged from the army and basically taken some of the ideas that they encountered and developed them basically outside of the army. So if you look at instant messaging, that was developed in the army, and then that led to a company that was later sold to AOL. But I think it's that kind of mindset that you're always measured on the innovation that you can bring. and what you need to do in order to really make Israel stand out in that sense. A lot of it is around cybersecurity, but a lot of other domains as well. And I think the other aspect is, again, relates to where Israel is. With the lack of natural resources, almost the only thing that Israel has is human capital. A lot of it is changing. So I think that the borders are now more open. There are a lot of agreements between Israel and its neighboring countries. But if you look at that, the thing that you can transfer most easily is technology, right? It's software, it's the internet things. So that was a lot of the investment the government had was around these areas. So it was around, okay, let's get good people, let's get investments. And there was time where the Israeli government was actually funding and matching all the funds that were funneling to the VC. It was very small at the time, but for every dollar that was poured in, the government put another dollar. So you had good people from various sources, academia, the army for sure, a lot of sort of hands-on experience, and then you brought in the government funding. And I think together that kind of created or gave that initial boost to the ecosystem in a country that did not have that until then. So that was, I think, the start. And I think from that evolution, Israel is a startup nation, moved up into being termed the scale-up nation, because a lot of the sort of first generation startups, a lot of them were acquired. Just in Israel alone, we have over, I think, 350 multinationals that have R&D centers. So these people started gaining experience from working with global, huge corporates. And I think that kind of transitioned the companies to that next level, which is really building companies and growing them, not just selling them early on. So yeah, it's quite an exciting ecosystem, I think.
Very nice. And we'll go into why Verizon Ventures, which is a US operators, have you in Israel. So we'll cover that. But on top of this formative opportunity in the army, then you went to what could be called the best school for thinking, which is McKinsey. How much of that time in McKinsey is useful to you today?
Like you said, I think McKinsey is probably one of the best schools that you can have. And I credit a lot of my career at what I learned at McKinsey, which is basically, I think, first of all, getting people from a lot of different industries. I had teams where we had that used to study volcanoes in Hawaii, along with somebody who studied theology, and I studied chemistry and physics, right? So none of us were that sort of typical financial consultants. And again, I think what McKinsey gives you is the skill set of coming for a very short period of time, getting a lot of understanding about the lay of the land, what are the different problems, champions, what can help you solve this, and then working alongside with the internal teams to actually come up with a solution, right? And later on, obviously, you need to implement it. But I think that is, for me, has been a part of the journey of being an investor. I think for us, we see a lot of companies. We need to understand in a relatively short time, is it interesting? Is it not? Is that the right time or not? And then once you decide about a certain target, is this an interesting company? Then you need to dive down and do it fairly quickly, right? Because the market is not waiting for you. You need to make that decision. And I think the other part of it that McKinsey kind of puts a lot of emphasis on is working with sort of the customer teams. For me now at Verizon, that means the internal teams, right? I need to find the internal champions. So how do you get them to look at innovation?
It's a golden nugget for me, because I did expect it would help you to become a better investor, deep diving quickly and assessing whether it's a good investment or not. But you're also talking about the value of communicating the value of the startup back to the mothership. And do you have a framework or a blueprint that you use to actually communicate the value of the startups back to the mothership?
I think that's an excellent question. I don't think I have a blueprint, but if I look at my day-to-day, I think most of the time that I spend internally, spend getting to know the people, getting to know the challenges, trying to understand what motivates them, and at the same time, what they can get from this company.
One thing I like is this small to big and big to small. So you worked with very big customers when you were at McKinsey, Then you work with very small companies, startups when you move to VCs. You move from a small VC to a very big VC and now a corporate VC. Can you share a bit more about this time you spent as a financial VC and how it shapes you as now a corporate VC, which has a much bigger remit than just the financial returns?
Absolutely. I think for me, working in the financial funds will tell you that they're value add investors. And it's true. I think always by having somebody external to the company, you're able to bring value. I think the one thing that was missing for me is really being able to impact the companies, right? So, yes, we get financial returns. Sometimes they're better, sometimes they're worse, but we generate more of the same. But I think for me, the key element that was missing was the market. And I think that's what a corporate fund is all about, is actually bringing the market to the companies. You're really able to change their future. When we invest in a company, we bring that entire monster Verizon behind us, right? At a flick of a button, we can bring them to millions of users, right?
And so maybe you could share a little bit about what it is concretely that you can bring to your portfolio companies that you wish you had when you were a financial VC.
I think that the benefits from Verizon Ventures are three-way, right? So one, it could be the customer, right? And I think if you look as far as telcos go, right, we're tier one telco in the US. We're the pioneers of 5G, right? So if companies are looking to do something in that domain, they should come talk to us. So one is us as a customer, and then we can be a channel and also be like a sell through model, right? Or sell with. So we can actually partner with you or be a channel. So I think, first of all, understanding that distinction, understanding what it is that we need from that startup and what's the rationale for us to invest versus just creating some sort of, we could look at commercial agreements, right? We can bring companies and say, okay, let's strike a commercial agreement. It makes sense. And in some cases it does. I don't think all the companies that we see turn out to be investments. I think, in fact, we probably, if you look at the number of companies that we see versus the number that we invest in, the investments are the minorities. But I think in those unique cases where we not only identify what the startup can benefit us, but we understand what we can do for them, I think that creates synergy that is very unique. I did not understand it as well as I do now before, because as a financial fund, you're like, show me the new logos for the month or for the quarter, show me a pipeline, show me percentages of success rate or whatever, but you're looking at metrics. And I think there's a lot of art, not science, behind the way that startups work with big corporates. And I think that's, for me, something that I completely learned, and I didn't know that. And I think that that really makes a difference.
Very nice. Financial VCs experience it very quickly, but for corporate VCs, it's the same, plus potentially the mothership feeling the downturn. Anything you've learned from previous downturn for the current conditions today?
I think for us, it's always been, if you look at what happened, I think in the last year and a half where things were crazy, I think we did not join that party. I think what really protects us as a corporate fund is the fact that we stick to a very strict strategy, right? So only things that are related to Verizon can go to that SIFT. And I think when you look at that, there are not that many opportunities. So for us, it's true that we feel the stress like everybody else. I think we feel it more internally in the sense that people may be less willing to look at innovation in that same kind of capacity because they're thinking about their next quarter more intensely than they did before. So I think for us, it's not really been that impactful in the sense of investments or the number of investments per se, because we usually do like a dozen a year, but for the enterprise as a whole.
Very nice. And you're making a very strong case on geographical diversity. But before we go there, you just mentioned that you're looking for a team decision. You talk about unanimous consensus. Does that not create a risk of going for the obvious versus the less obvious investments? And here I'm thinking about contrarian view versus consensus view.
It probably does create that, but I think it's, again, a matter of time, right? There are times where I think we look at things differently, and there's different people at the business units where they're more open to things that are going to happen 5 years down the line, and we can invest in something that's a bit more risky. And then there's some places where we say, okay, we're going to invest in things that are a bit more obvious. But again, I think because 5G is so new and so groundbreaking, I don't think any of the investments we've made could be obvious yet, or not obvious successes yet. There's a lot to go do yet in these cases.
Yeah, it definitively is. Now, let's talk about geographical coverage. You made a good case earlier, but let's start very simply. Verizon in US, why Israel?
I think it really happened historically when Verizon acquired AOL and Yahoo. So at the time, AOL had an incubator here in Israel. So I think when Verizon acquired that, they were aware that there is some sort of an investment vehicle here in Israel. But I think that when they acquired it, they sort of noticed, not sure noticed is the right word, but they became aware of the ecosystem in Israel, which is really the second largest after the US. So there's a lot of things here that Israel is very known for, and I think caught Verizon's eye. So cybersecurity being the obvious, a lot of deep tech, again, human capital, that's what the state of Israel has, no natural resources. I think that was the startup or entrepreneurial movement, but they said, okay, let's start Verizon Ventures in Israel.
How do you track all of these engagements, and do you have someone dedicated to do it, or is it the team as a whole who looks at tracking the progress of these engagements?
We do it, I think, in the most simplistic way, where we have this giant Excel. We keep all the point of contacts and where things are shared by the whole team so everybody can see. And that's the way we track it. We probably should have been more tech about it, but that's just the way we do it.
Wow, a master Excel spreadsheet is not what I expected. Very nice. How do you decide who's driving the investment?
Luckily, we've not come across these sort of situations often, but I would say that I think the first split is geographic and the second one is domain. So if I have a colleague of mine who's doing a lot of network investments and I see a really good network company here in Israel, I think we'll do it together, because I think there's a lot of the knowledge that's part of the local ecosystem. You need to know the culture, you need to know the partners, but then there's the domain. And I think ultimately, if it's an interesting company and we want what's best for it and what's best for Verizon, then we'll share this. And I think the one thing that you can say about our team is that I don't think we have a lot of ego. So
That's
people
right.
are willing to share. And I think just from a kind of practical matter, it's that it doesn't make sense for me to do an investment in the US unless it's an Israeli entrepreneur in the US, in which case I may be involved. But other than that, I think we really do our own thing, but we try to help each other.
So you tag team when it makes sense, but otherwise you don't.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So we're talking about the team. Any best practices or tips to the audience about recruitment? And what type of profile makes more sense for a corporate VC versus not?
First and foremost, I think you need to understand corporate culture. It's not flashy like financial funds where people are like, oh, I'm going to get rich. That's not the corporate life, right? So I think you need to understand what it means to work in a corporate in terms of both what it is that you're driving, what it is you're delivering, and definitely the pace of the work, right? In terms of the kind of best practices, I think I've seen people from all sorts of backgrounds. So financial funds, business development, strategy, just people that came out from the business, right? They know the business well, and they want to move on from just the business to looking at things from an investment perspective. So I think really all of that would work as long as you understand where you're landing, know the landscape, try to interview people, ask them about how it is they spend their days, right? I think for me, it was very helpful when I came in and the person that I asked said, I'm doing a lot of internal corporate development and external, right? So for me, it was okay. It was something that I didn't do. I did not talk to potential, that there's nothing like that in the financial funds. There's no comparable, right? So for me, it's like really pretty much like you would do in any other job. Interview as many people as you can to understand what it takes. But I think if you got a good background in strategy, business development, investments, or you know your business very well. So for instance, for Verizon networks very well, I think these are all great places to start. And I think if you get excited by innovation, right, you need to be excited about innovation, about creating new things. And if you have that, definitely something you need to pursue.
Very nice. Now, one more thing which is different for corporate VCs and financial VCs is a side letters that comes with an investment. And they vary differently between CVCs, but can you give a framework of mind about how to think about side letters for a corporate VC and how to explain them to the entrepreneurs?
Yeah, it's an excellent point. I think you're touching something that we come across every single investment that we make, pretty much every single investment. And I think the best way to describe it is, again, being very upfront and very honest. So for me, it's explaining to the startup, to the CEO, what it is that we need. Where does that come from and why do we need it? And sometimes we say, look, we understand if you're going to take this, let's say we're asking for information rights. We understand that it may not come as something with this kind of investment level, but this is why we need it. And we understand, and we say to them, look, we understand if we stop investing at one point or another, that you can take this off, right? That sort of always is the premise. As long as we continue to be your partner, this is what we need and why we need it. I've not come across situations where when we have this discussion, they can talk, we can negotiate on the thresholds for things, but it's not a matter where they can dismiss it completely and say, okay, we're not willing to give that. So I think, again, being very honest of what you need and why you need it. And again, I think startups want to work with us, or the ones that find that strategic alignment want to work with us.
And we say with us, I think it's with Verizon. There is clearly a lot of value from engaging with Verizon. And maybe here a question also is about how do you manage the pre-investment engagement, like priming the pump in a way, and post-investment? Is it a continuous process, or do you see a difference from the before and after an investment stage?
I think it's always easier when a company becomes a portfolio, because then we can say, look, you have pretty much an inherent or joint alignment to have this as a success, right? Because we're invested in the company. So you want it to be successful. I find it more easy kind of across the different units that we're talking to, not internally in the ventures team. Because if it's a company we want to invest in and we're bullish about it, that's not going to change because we made the investment. But it's an easier sell to the organization. And I think also for the startup, there's some commitment already. So when we ask them things and we ask them to join multiple calls that are not necessarily going to end up in something meaningful for them, it also creates that goodwill. So I think that's where I see the difference between before and after, but not for us in ventures.
Very nice. And so my last question is going to be about what's next for you. But before that, does this requirement for adding value and this engagement, does it mean that you actually can't invest in what's coming for in 5 or 10 years, like 6G? Is that so far out that actually can't invest, even though it could be helpful for Verizon to know the innovations very early on? Or do you have ways to do that?
We've not come across these as well, but I think 6G is definitely going to be something of an interest over the next few years, and we've not fully deployed 5G, right? The sweet spot is A and B. So I think predominantly that's where we're going to invest. We're not going to invest earlier. And I think that's something, again, that we also need to navigate between the company, right? Because I think we want to invest, let's say A and B. We like to invest early, where I think the business can really work well with kind of a more mature company, right? So we always have that gap that we need to bridge. So I think, again, it will be in some super strategic cases where we say, okay, that's a company we're willing to take the risk and invest earlier because we believe that's going to end up there. It's not where we're, I think, doing our best. I think we do best where we can involve the business and get more feedback. But because these earlier stages tend to be less money, I think it's a lesser risk in a way for the corporates. We can say, okay, we put in this amount. It's significantly less than what we typically invest, but we believe in this and we want to do that. We've done a few of those, but I think the majority is not going to be these cases. I think it's that balance. I think it's that gap between earlier stage of investment versus corporate can work with mature companies that you always try to navigate.
Tammy, I think it's the best way to end this interview. Thank you so much. You've been amazing at sharing candidly your best practices, your journey, and how Verizon Ventures work and think about adding value to entrepreneurs.
Thank you so much, Nicholas.